People think a storm changes the weather. They're wrong. Sometimes, it changes the person who walks out of it. Every time thunder rolled across the mountains, I found myself remembering that night. 8 years had passed, yet the sound still reached a place inside me no amount of time had ever managed to heal. I was standing in front of the same weathered cabin, its cedar walls faded by countless winters, its porch leaning ever so slightly, as if it had grown tired of carrying old memories. Rain drummed softly against the roof, almost identical to the rhythm I had heard on the night everything changed. I never planned to come back here. In fact, I had spent years convincing myself I never would. Life had carried me far away from these mountains. I finished college, built a career as a graphic designer in Seattle, rented an apartment overlooking Elliott Bay, and learned how to fill my calendar so completely that loneliness rarely had room to breathe. At least, that was the story I told everyone else. The truth was much simpler. Some memories don't disappear. They wait. They sit quietly in forgotten corners until one familiar scent, one familiar sound, or one unexpected rainstorm reminds you they were never gone at all. My name is Ethan Parker, and if you had met me at 22, you probably would have described me as quiet, dependable, maybe even a little invisible. I had always lived in the shadow of my older brother, Mason. He was the confident one, the kind of man who could walk into any room and instantly make friends. Growing up, I admired him more than anyone. Wherever Mason went, people followed. And wherever Mason went, one person was almost always beside him. Ryan Carter. Ryan had been my brother's best friend for as long as I could remember. 7 years older than me, he carried himself with an easy confidence that never crossed into arrogance. He worked as a search and rescue pilot, volunteered on weekends, and somehow remembered everyone's birthday without ever writing them down. To me, he was simply Ryan, the man who fixed broken fences without being asked, who always showed up with an extra fishing pole because he assumed someone would forget theirs, and who somehow made every room feel calmer the moment he entered. I spent years pretending I looked at him the same way everyone else did. I became very good at pretending. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Mason had planned a family camping trip deep in the Cascades before accepting a last-minute overseas assignment. He called me that afternoon, apologizing for canceling, insisting Ryan would drive up instead so I wouldn't lose the reservation I'd been looking forward to for months. I almost said no. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder how different my life would have been if I had. But fate has a strange way of sounding ordinary when it first knocks on your door. By sunset, dark clouds swallowed the mountains. The weather forecast underestimated the storm. Roads flooded. Cell service disappeared. And somewhere between the first crack of thunder and the cabin lights flickering out, I found myself completely alone with the one person I had spent years trying not to love. The storm settled over the mountains with astonishing speed, turning the narrow gravel road into a ribbon of mud long before Ryan parked his truck beside the cabin. Rain hammered against the windshield so hard that the world beyond the glass dissolved into shifting shades of gray. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. The engine ticked quietly as it cooled, and the only other sound was the steady rhythm of water drumming on the roof. Ryan let out a slow breath before reaching for the flashlight tucked behind his seat. "Looks like we made it just in time," he said with the same calm confidence he always seemed to carry, even when nature had other plans. I nodded, suddenly aware that the weekend I had imagined spending alone had disappeared the moment he volunteered to come instead of Mason. We hurried through the rain, laughing as icy water soaked our jackets before we reached the porch. Ryan unlocked the cabin with the spare key my brother always kept hidden beneath an old flower pot, and within moments we were standing inside surrounded by the comforting scent of cedar, old books, and a fireplace that had probably witnessed decades of family memories. The lights flickered once as Ryan switched them on. Then they flickered again. "Power might not last," he said, setting his backpack on the floor. "We should get a fire going while we still can." I watched him move naturally through the familiar space, stacking firewood with practiced hands before striking a match. The flames slowly awakened, casting warm amber light across the room as thunder rolled somewhere deep beyond the trees. For the first time that evening, I felt my shoulders relax. We unpacked groceries, heated canned soup on the old gas stove, and shared dinner at the small wooden table beside the window. Conversation came easier than I expected. Ryan asked about my design projects in Seattle, remembered details I had mentioned months earlier, and listened with genuine interest instead of waiting for his turn to speak. It surprised me how much that simple kindness meant. Outside, the storm only grew stronger. Wind bent towering pines until their branches scraped against the cabin walls like restless fingers. Then, without warning, the lights vanished completely. The room fell into darkness before the fire reclaimed it with flickering gold. Ryan smiled as if losing electricity was merely another part of the evening. He found several old candles inside a kitchen drawer and placed them around the room until gentle light danced across the wooden walls. There was something strangely peaceful about it. Without phones, television, or internet, the outside world simply disappeared. Time slowed. We played an old deck of cards we found in the cabinet, argued playfully over the rules to games neither of us remembered correctly, and laughed more than we had in years. Somewhere between one story and the next, I realized I had stopped thinking about how carefully I needed to guard my feelings around him. For a little while, I was simply enjoying his company. Ryan leaned back in his chair, studying the fire with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said quietly, "your brother always worried about you after you moved away. He thought you carried too much on your own." I looked into the flames, unsure how to answer. Maybe he was right. Ryan shook his head gently. "No, I think you just got used to believing you had to handle everything alone." His words settled somewhere deep inside me because they were true in a way I had never admitted, even to myself. Another crack of thunder echoed through the mountains, louder than before, rattling the cabin windows. Neither of us realized that the longest night of my life had only just begun. The fire had burned low enough that Ryan stood to add another log, and as fresh flames climbed through the darkened fireplace, the entire cabin seemed to breathe again. Outside, rain crashed against the windows with relentless determination, and the wind howled through the towering evergreens like an old song carried across the mountains. We had nowhere to go until morning, and strangely, neither of us seemed eager for the night to end. Ryan returned to his chair with 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate he had somehow managed to make from supplies hidden in the kitchen cabinet. He handed one to me with a quiet smile. "Your brother always forgot these were here," he said. "I never did." I laughed softly. "You remember everything." He shrugged. "Only the things that matter." Those words lingered in my mind far longer than they should have. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching shadows dance across the wooden walls while the storm wrapped the cabin in complete isolation. There was something about the absence of the outside world that made ordinary conversations feel unexpectedly honest. Ryan asked me why I had chosen Seattle after college instead of staying close to home. I stared into my mug before answering. Because it was easier to leave than explain why I never felt like I belonged anywhere. He studied me carefully, not with pity, but with genuine curiosity. "Did you ever find what you were looking for?" I smiled without humor. "If I did, I must have missed it." Ryan leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I do not think you give yourself enough credit, Ethan. You have always been stronger than you believe." I looked away toward the rain streaking across the window. "That is easy for someone like you to say." He frowned slightly. "Someone like me? The guy everyone depends on. The one who always knows what to do." Ryan let out a quiet laugh. "You really think that is who I am?" I nodded. "Ever since I was a kid." For the first time since we arrived, his confident expression faded. "The truth is, I have spent most of my life hoping nobody notices how often I doubt myself." That confession caught me completely off guard. Ryan had always seemed unshakable, the kind of person who naturally carried other people's burdens. Hearing uncertainty in his voice made him feel unexpectedly human. He looked toward the fire before continuing. "Flying rescue missions teaches you something. People see the helicopter landing. They see the uniform. They assume you are fearless. They never see the nights afterward when you lie awake wondering if there was something else you could have done." I had never heard him speak like that before. His words stripped away the image I had built over years and revealed someone quieter, someone carrying invisible weight beneath his steady smile. Without thinking, I reached across the small space between our chairs and rested my hand gently over his for only a brief moment. It was not planned. It was simply the most natural response to seeing someone I admired allow himself to be vulnerable. Neither of us moved. Ryan looked down at our hands, then back at me. His expression was unreadable, but there was warmth in his eyes that I had never noticed before. My heartbeat quickened, and I quietly withdrew my hand, suddenly aware of what I had done. "Sorry," I whispered. Ryan shook his head almost immediately. "You do not have to apologize." Another flash of lightning illuminated the cabin for a single breathtaking second before darkness returned, leaving only the glow of the fire between us. Neither of us spoke again for a long time, but the silence had changed. It no longer belonged to two people passing time until morning. It belonged to two hearts that had quietly crossed an invisible line neither of them fully understood, while outside the storm continued to erase every road leading back to the lives we thought we would return to. Sometime after midnight, the rain softened from a furious roar into a steady rhythm, but neither of us made any attempt to sleep. The old clock above the fireplace ticked patiently through the quiet, while the fire settled into glowing embers that filled the cabin with gentle warmth. Ryan eventually stood and pulled a thick wool blanket from the closet before draping it across the back of the couch. "You should try to get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow will probably be a long drive once the roads reopen." I smiled faintly. "I do not think I am going to sleep tonight." He looked at me with that familiar expression that always seemed to notice more than I intended to reveal. "Because of the storm?" I hesitated before answering. "Maybe. Or maybe because this is the first time in a long time that I have not felt like I had to pretend to be someone else." Ryan remained silent for several seconds. Then he quietly sat beside me instead of returning to his chair. We stared into the fire together, close enough to hear each other breathe, but careful to leave a respectful space between us. The silence felt natural, almost comforting. After a while he spoke so softly I almost missed it. "I have been pretending too." I turned toward him. "About what?" He gave a small, thoughtful smile without taking his eyes off the flames. "About how simple everything is supposed to be." I frowned, unsure what he meant. "Everyone assumes I always know the right decision because I stay calm. The truth is, some decisions become harder the more they matter." His words lingered between us like the warmth rising from the fireplace. I wanted to ask what decision he was talking about, but something told me he was still deciding whether to finish the thought. Outside, another flash of lightning briefly illuminated the room before fading into darkness. Ryan finally looked at me, and for the first time since I had known him, there was uncertainty behind his steady eyes. "Ethan," he said quietly, "have you ever wished life had introduced people in a different order?" The question caught me completely off guard. "I am not sure." He nodded slowly, almost as if he expected that answer. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had met you first instead of becoming your brother's friend all those years ago." My heartbeat became impossible to ignore. I searched his face, trying to decide whether I had misunderstood him, but there was no trace of humor there. Only honesty, the kind that asks for nothing except to be heard. I lowered my eyes, afraid that if I looked at him too long he would see everything I had spent years hiding. "Ryan," his voice interrupted mine with remarkable gentleness. "You do not have to say anything. I just got tired of pretending that tonight feels ordinary." 1,000 thoughts rushed through my mind at once. I thought about Mason, about our family, about every holiday, every fishing trip, every birthday where Ryan had simply been part of our lives. I thought about how impossible everything suddenly seemed. Yet beneath all those fears was an undeniable feeling of relief. I was no longer carrying this secret alone. The fire crackled softly as another log settled deeper into the embers. Almost without thinking, our eyes met again, and this time neither of us looked away. No promises were made. No boundaries were crossed. We simply remained there, sharing the quiet certainty that whatever happened after sunrise, neither of us would ever remember this night as just another storm. The first pale light of morning slipped through the cabin windows just before the rain finally stopped. Mist drifted between the towering pine trees, softening the entire mountainside until it looked more like a dream than a place either of us had actually visited. I realized I had fallen asleep on the couch for barely an hour, wrapped in the wool blanket Ryan had quietly placed over my shoulders sometime before dawn. He was already awake, standing on the porch with a steaming mug of coffee, staring toward the valley below where clouds slowly lifted from the forest. For a moment, I simply watched him through the window, wondering if the honesty we had shared beside the fire had only existed because the storm had hidden us from the rest of the world. When I stepped outside, the morning air carried the clean scent of rain and cedar. Ryan turned toward me with a gentle smile that looked almost familiar, yet somehow different. After everything that had been said, "Looks like the weather finally decided to be kind," he said. I smiled back. "Maybe it got tired before we did." He laughed quietly, and the sound eased the nervousness that had settled inside me. We stood side by side without speaking, listening to birds cautiously return to the trees as if they were testing whether the storm had truly ended. Eventually, Ryan glanced toward the narrow road leading away from the cabin. "The county will probably clear the fallen branches within a couple of hours. We should be able to leave before lunch." Leave. The word landed heavier than I expected. I had spent years believing I wanted ordinary days, predictable routines, and uncomplicated relationships. Yet after one unforgettable night, returning to ordinary suddenly felt impossible. Inside the cabin, we packed our bags together, moving naturally around each other in the quiet space. Every now and then our hands reached for the same item at the same time, followed by awkward smiles that neither of us seemed able to explain. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no grand confession, no impossible promise, only a growing awareness that something invisible had shifted between us. Before locking the cabin, Ryan paused with his hand resting on the old wooden door. "Ethan," he said carefully, "whatever happens after today, I do not want you to think last night was a mistake." My heart beat faster, but I answered honestly, "I never thought it was." He nodded once, though his expression carried both relief and concern. Neither did I. The drive down the mountain was quieter than the trip up had been. Sunlight broke through the clouds in scattered beams, reflecting off wet pavement and turning every stream into liquid silver. As the miles disappeared beneath the tires, familiar landmarks slowly returned, bringing the outside world back with them. Cell phone signals reappeared. Missed messages arrived one after another. Reality was waiting exactly where we had left it. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Mason asking how the weekend had gone and whether Ryan had kept me out of trouble. I looked at the screen for several seconds before placing the phone back in my pocket without pressing play. Ryan noticed, but said nothing. When we finally reached my apartment building in Seattle, he parked along the curb and turned off the engine. For a long moment, neither of us reached for the door handle. The silence was not uncomfortable. It simply carried the weight of two people who understood that the hardest part of any journey is often the moment it ends. Ryan finally looked at me with quiet sincerity. "Take care of yourself, Ethan." I met his eyes and smiled, unaware that those simple words would become our goodbye for far longer than either of us could have imagined. Weeks quietly turned into months, and months slowly became years measured not by calendars, but by everything I never said. Ryan and I exchanged a few polite messages during the first several weeks after that weekend. They were simple conversations about work, family, or the weather, carefully avoiding the one subject that lingered beneath every sentence. Then life began filling the empty spaces between those messages. His rescue assignments grew more demanding. My career in Seattle expanded faster than I expected. The distance between us became something neither of us openly acknowledged, yet both of us quietly accepted. Every now and then Mason would call to tell me Ryan had been promoted or had helped coordinate another successful search in the mountains. He always spoke with pride, never realizing how carefully I listened for even the smallest detail. I would smile, congratulate Ryan through my brother, and then spend the rest of the evening wondering whether Ryan ever thought about the cabin when another storm rolled across the mountains. I dated a few people during those years because it seemed like the normal thing to do. They were kind, thoughtful, and deserved someone whose heart was completely available. Mine never was. Every relationship ended with the same gentle conversation. They would tell me I seemed emotionally distant, as though a part of me was always somewhere else. They were right. I simply could not explain where that somewhere else was. It was a quiet cabin surrounded by rain and pine trees, where honesty had briefly felt easier than fear. My career continued moving forward. I became creative director at a growing design agency, bought a small townhouse overlooking the water, and built a life that looked successful from every angle. Friends congratulated me. My parents proudly showed family members photographs of my office. Mason joked that I had finally become the responsible sibling. I laughed along because it was easier than admitting success and happiness are not always the same thing. Then, almost 8 years after that unforgettable weekend, Mason called unexpectedly on a Tuesday afternoon. His voice sounded more serious than usual. "Ryan is coming back," he said. I stopped typing immediately. "Back where?" "Home. His father has been diagnosed with a heart condition, and he is taking an extended leave to help his family." For several seconds I forgot how to answer. Ryan had spent years living in Colorado after accepting a leadership position with a regional rescue aviation program. I had convinced myself that the thousands of miles between us were permanent. Hearing that he would return felt strangely unreal, as though the past had quietly opened a door I believed was locked forever. Mason continued speaking, completely unaware of the storm beginning inside my thoughts. "Mom wants everyone together next weekend for Dad's birthday. Ryan said he will probably stop by too. It has been forever since you two have seen each other." Forever. The words settled heavily in my chest. After we ended the call, I walked to the window overlooking Elliott Bay. Gray clouds stretched across the sky, and a light rain had begun falling over the water. I smiled despite myself. It almost felt like the weather remembered before I did. For the rest of the week, I found it impossible to focus. Every memory I had carefully packed away over the years quietly returned, not with regret, but with unanswered questions. I had no idea who Ryan had become after 8 years apart. I did not know whether he had fallen in love, started a family, or completely forgotten the promises that had never actually been spoken. I only knew that after all this time, our paths were about to cross again, and deep inside I sensed that some stories do not end when people walk away. They simply wait for the right moment to begin their next chapter. The drive back to my hometown felt strangely familiar, as though every mile was carrying me toward a version of myself I had left behind years earlier. The streets looked smaller than I remembered. The old coffee shop still stood on the corner of Main Street, and the maple trees lining our neighborhood had grown tall enough to cast long shadows across the sidewalks where Mason and I used to race our bicycles every summer. My parents welcomed me with warm hugs, familiar laughter, and the unmistakable smell of my mother's homemade pot roast drifting through the house. Everything looked exactly the same, yet I knew one person had the power to make the entire afternoon feel completely different. I heard Ryan's voice before I saw him. He was helping my father carry folding chairs from the garage into the backyard, speaking with the same calm confidence I remembered, although there was something quieter about him now. 8 years had added a few faint lines around his eyes, but they only made his smile seem warmer. When he finally turned toward the house, our eyes met across the yard. Time seemed to hesitate. Neither of us moved for a brief moment. Then he smiled with genuine surprise. "Ethan." Hearing my name in his voice after so many years stirred something I thought had settled long ago. I walked over, suddenly aware of how awkward simple greetings could become when two people carried an entire history inside their silence. "It has been a while," I said. Ryan nodded. "Longer than it should have been." Before either of us could say more, Mason called us over to help arrange the tables, and the afternoon continued with conversations, laughter, and family stories that flowed around us like a gentle current. Ryan and I spoke only in small moments. We carried coolers together, set plates on picnic tables, and occasionally exchanged quiet smiles that somehow said more than complete conversations ever could. Later that evening, after most of the family had gone inside for dessert, I stepped onto the back porch for a little fresh air. The sun had already slipped below the horizon, leaving behind a sky painted in soft shades of orange and blue. I heard the screen door open behind me before Ryan quietly joined me. For several seconds, we simply looked across the backyard where strings of lights glowed above the fence. Finally, he spoke. "I owe you an explanation." I turned toward him without saying a word. He took a slow breath. "After that weekend in the mountains, I wanted to call you every day. More than once, I even drove halfway to Seattle before turning around." My heart tightened. "Then why did you disappear?" Ryan lowered his eyes briefly before answering. "Because I talked to your brother." The words caught me completely off guard. "Mason?" He nodded slowly. "He never knew what happened between us because nothing inappropriate happened. But he did tell me something that stayed with me. He said you were finally building your own future and that the last thing you needed was people making your life more complicated. I realized that if I stayed close, I could become exactly that complication." I stared at him, unable to speak. Ryan continued quietly. "So I accepted the position in Colorado. I convinced myself distance would make everything easier for both of us. It never did. The evening breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass across the yard as his words settled between us. For 8 years I had believed silence meant indifference. Now I understood it had been sacrifice. Ryan finally met my eyes again, his voice almost a whisper. The hardest decision I ever made was walking away from someone I never stopped caring about. I thought I was protecting your future, Ethan. I never imagined I was also leaving behind the life I wanted most. Ryan's words remained with me long after the conversation ended. We returned to the backyard just as my mother placed slices of birthday cake on the table, and everyone resumed talking as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Mason laughed at one of my father's old stories. My mother insisted everyone take leftovers home, and children from the neighboring house chased fireflies along the fence. It was an ordinary family evening, yet nothing inside me felt ordinary anymore. For the first time in 8 years, I finally understood that silence had never meant rejection. It had been built from fear, loyalty, and the impossible hope that sacrificing happiness might somehow protect someone else. A few days later, Ryan called and asked if I wanted to meet for coffee before I returned to Seattle. His voice was calm, but I could hear the uncertainty beneath it. I agreed without hesitation. We met at the same small coffee shop where Mason used to bring us after weekend fishing trips. The place had been renovated since I was younger, but the smell of fresh coffee and warm cinnamon rolls felt exactly the same. Ryan arrived a few minutes early, holding the door open with the same quiet courtesy I remembered. We spent nearly 2 hours talking, not about the past at first, but about everything that had happened while we were apart. He told me about the years in Colorado, the rescue crews that had become like family, and the difficult decision to return home when his father became ill. I told him about my work, the projects that had filled my calendar, and the relationships that never quite became the future everyone expected. Eventually, the conversation found its way back to the one subject we had avoided for too long. Ryan looked down at his coffee before speaking. If I could go back, I would handle everything differently. I would trust you enough to let you make your own decision. I smiled gently. We were both trying to protect someone. We just forgot to protect ourselves. He nodded, and for the first time since we had reunited, the weight in his expression seemed to ease. As we walked outside, a light breeze carried the scent of summer across the quiet street. Ryan stopped beside his truck and turned toward me. I do not expect anything from you, Ethan. 8 years is a long time. People change. I looked at him carefully before answering. People do change. But sometimes they also become honest enough to admit what has never changed. His eyes searched mine, waiting. I never stopped wondering what our lives would have looked like if we had not let fear decide for us, I said quietly. A slow smile spread across his face, not because every problem had suddenly disappeared, but because hope had finally returned. During the following weeks, we spoke almost every day. Sometimes the conversations lasted only a few minutes. Sometimes they stretched late into the evening as we shared stories we had missed over the years. There was no rush to define what we were becoming. We allowed trust to grow naturally, stronger than it had ever been before. When I eventually told Mason that Ryan and I had been spending time together, he surprised me by smiling instead of looking shocked. He admitted he had realized long ago that we understood each other in a way few people ever could. He apologized for believing distance had been the safest answer all those years earlier. Looking back, none of us had acted out of anger. We had simply been trying to do the right thing with incomplete understanding. Now, for the first time, we had the chance to choose differently, not because the past had changed, but because we finally had the courage to stop running from it. 8 months later, Ryan called and asked if I wanted to take one more drive into the mountains before winter arrived. This time there was no unexpected storm, no uncertainty about why we were going, and no fear waiting quietly beneath every conversation. We simply wanted to return to the place where 2 lives had unknowingly changed direction. The road looked almost the same as I remembered, winding through dense forests that glowed with the gold and crimson colors of late autumn. When the old cabin finally came into view, I felt the same strange mixture of nostalgia and gratitude that had followed me ever since that unforgettable weekend years before. Ryan unlocked the familiar wooden door, and the comforting scent of cedar greeted us once again. Time had left its mark on the cabin, but it still carried the same quiet warmth that had welcomed us on that rainy night. We spent the afternoon cleaning fallen branches from the porch, replacing a loose railing, and stacking fresh firewood for whoever might visit after us. It felt less like returning to the past and more like honoring it. As evening settled over the mountains, we lit a fire inside the stone fireplace and watched gentle flames fill the room with soft amber light. Outside, clouds slowly gathered above the trees, and before long the first raindrops began tapping against the roof. Ryan smiled when he heard them. Looks like the mountains wanted to remind us of something. I laughed quietly. Or maybe they wanted to see whether we finally learned the lesson. He looked at me with the same calm kindness that had always made me feel understood. And did we? I nodded without hesitation. I think we finally learned that fear is not supposed to decide who gets to stay in our lives. Ryan reached over and gently took my hand, his fingers warm against mine. It was a simple gesture, filled not with urgency, but with certainty. There was no need for dramatic promises because everything that mattered had already been proven through patience, honesty, and the courage to begin again after years of silence. We sat together listening to the rain as darkness settled beyond the windows. This time the storm did not feel like something separating us from the world. It simply became part of the evening, another familiar sound woven into a memory that no longer carried sadness. Before we left the next morning, I paused on the porch and looked across the valley where mist drifted through the towering pines exactly as it had years before. I realized that I no longer wished I could change the past. Every difficult decision, every unanswered question, and every mile of distance had eventually led us back to the truth we had been too young to trust. Ryan stood beside me, slipping his hands into the pockets of his jacket as the morning breeze carried the clean scent of rain through the trees. "Ready?" he asked. I smiled, not because I knew what every tomorrow would bring, but because I finally knew who I wanted beside me when it arrived. "More than ever," I answered. As we walked toward the truck, the clouds slowly parted and sunlight spread across the mountains, turning the wet forest into countless shades of green and gold. Looking back one last time, I understood something that had taken me years to learn. A storm can change the course of a single night, but love, when built on patience, honesty, and quiet courage, can change the course of an entire lifetime. And for the first time, the sound of rain no longer reminded me of what I had almost lost. It reminded me of everything we had finally found.